The first time Cora Vett laughed at something Seth Briar said, he looked so startled you'd have thought she'd fired a pistol into the ceiling. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the schoolhouse at the edge of Dunmore Creek had sprung its second leak of the season, right above the chalkboard, of all places, so that the letters dripped before the children could copy them down. Cora had sent the students home early and was standing on a chair trying to wedge a folded flour sack into the gap between two warped roof boards when the door opened and Seth came in out of the cold. He was the town's farrier, and he had no business being in a schoolhouse at 2:30 on a weekday. But his forge sat directly across the lane, and he'd seen her up on the chair through the window, and apparently that had been enough. "You'll go through the floor before you fix the roof," he said. Cora turned and looked at him. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, hands darkened from the forge work, jaw carrying about 3 days of stubble that hadn't decided yet whether it was a beard. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim. She'd seen him do that before. He did it whenever he didn't quite know what to do with himself. "The floor's pine," she said. "It'll hold. It's old pine. So is everything in this building." He stood there a moment, looking up at the leak, then at her, then at the ceiling again. "I could fix that," he said. "Properly. I wasn't asking." "No," he agreed. "You weren't." He left, and Cora climbed down from the chair, and that should have been the end of it. Except that on Saturday morning she came in to find 3 new shingles on the schoolhouse roof, and no note, no invoice, no indication of who had done it. Though the lane outside smelled faintly of coal smoke, and the forge had been lit earlier than usual, she didn't say anything, neither did he. That was how it started between Seth Briar and Cora Vett, in silence, in cold weather, with a problem fixed that nobody had officially asked him to fix. Dunmore Creek sat in the foothills of the Rockies, in a valley that got 5 months of hard winter, and 4 months of mud, and 3 months of something almost tolerable, and people who lived there were generally the kind who'd tried somewhere easier first and hadn't fit. Cora had come from Lethbridge, 2 years out of a teacher's college that no longer existed, hired on a 1-year contract that had now quietly become 3 years, without either party formally acknowledging the extension. She rented a room at the back of Hazel Muir's boarding house, ate dinner with the Muir family on weeknights, and spent her weekends marking papers and rereading the same 4 novels she'd brought with her from Lethbridge. She was 26 years old. She had dark eyes and a way of looking at people that made them feel she was cataloging them, which she was. She'd grown up the youngest of 5 in a crowded house where you either learned to observe or got talked over, and she'd chosen observation early and stuck with it. Seth had been in Dunmore Creek for 7 years, which made him nearly a local by the valley's standards. He'd come up from Medicine Hat after his father's health had forced the sale of their ranch, taken over the farrier trade from old Vernon Sykes, who'd wanted to retire, and simply stayed. He was 31. He owned his forge, the small house beside it, and a dog named Petch, who had 1 brown ear and 1 white one, and who slept in the doorway of the forge regardless of the temperature. What Cora knew about Seth before that October was approximately this. He was reliable, he was quiet, he charged fair rates. He showed up when he said he would, and he once carried Mrs. Dunbar's groceries up from the supply wagon without being asked, and then walked away before she could thank him. What she thought about him, she wouldn't have admitted to thinking anything in particular. He was a fact of the town, like the mountains in the mud season. You didn't form opinions about facts. But she'd noticed the hat turning. She'd noticed that. November came in hard that year, with 2 feet of snow before the month was a week old. The pass road closed for 3 days and then opened again and then closed a second time, and Dunmore Creek turned inward the way small places do in winter, everyone burning through their stored provisions and patience in roughly equal measure. Cora's classroom filled with children who smelled of wood smoke and wet wool, and she taught them fractions and the names of the provinces and the difference between a simile and a metaphor, and at 3:30 she walked across the frozen lane to go home and past Seth's forge every single day. Sometimes the door was open and she could see him working, the orange glow of the coals, sparks jumping, the steady ringing sound that carried even through the cold. Sometimes Petch was sitting outside, apparently unbothered by the temperature, watching her cross the lane with the same attentive dignity with which he watched everything. On a Thursday in mid-November, the dog followed her. Not all the way, just to the edge of his territory, whatever invisible line he'd drawn in the snow. But he walked beside her for 30 feet and then sat down and watched her the rest of the way. And she looked back once, and the dog was still sitting there, and behind him in the doorway of the forge, Seth was watching too. He looked away when she caught him. She kept walking. She told herself it meant nothing. She was very convincing. The Christmas social was held at the church hall on the 20th of December, and the whole valley turned out because there was nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. And Hazel Muir made her butter tarts, which people drove 4 hours for on a good road, and someone brought a fiddle, and the children put on a short play about a shepherd and a lost sheep that went sideways, when the boy playing the shepherd tripped over the girl playing the sheep, and they both dissolved into laughter. Cora was standing near the back when Seth appeared beside her. He had made some effort, a clean shirt, his hair pushed back, though it was already escaping at the sides. He was holding a cup of cider in each hand, and he offered her one without asking if she wanted it, which she found she didn't mind. "You're students," he said, nodding at the stage. "They rehearsed for 2 weeks," she said. It showed. She laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, not polite, and he looked so completely unprepared for it that she laughed again. "You looked surprised," she said. "I didn't know you did that." "Did what?" He seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. "Nothing," he said. Never mind. But she'd heard him, or heard enough. She turned back to the stage where the children were taking their bows, and she thought, he's been watching me too. Not in a bad way. Not in the way that made you want to step away. In the way of someone who's been looking and hoping not to be caught looking, which she understood personally and completely. She didn't say anything about it. The fiddle started up, and people began to clear the middle of the floor, and Seth excused himself and went to stand with Len Ashby by the door, and Cora danced one reel with Margaret Petrie's husband because Margaret's knee was bad, and the evening ended and everyone went home in the cold. But on the walk back to Hazel's, with the snow coming down in big slow flakes, she found herself smiling and not entirely able to say why. January was hard. February was harder. The cold that settled into Dunmore Creek in the new year was the serious kind. The kind that got into the buildings, that frosted the inside of window panes, that made the horses miserable and the children listless, and the adults short-tempered in the way of people who have been cold for too long. Cora kept the schoolhouse stove burning hot and let the older students take turns adding wood because it gave them something to do and because the movement kept them awake. Seth's forge was busy. Cold weather was hard on horseshoes, hard on hinges and runners and all the metal joints that kept the valley's equipment functioning, and she'd see him at it late some evenings when she was sitting at her desk marking by lamplight. The orange glow across the lane, the ring of the hammer still going at 8. 9 o'clock, she began leaving a covered pot of tea on the schoolhouse step on the coldest evenings. She told herself it was for anyone who happened to pass. She left it on the step closest to the forge. She didn't know if he took it. She didn't look. On the third evening, there was a folded piece of brown paper tucked under the pot when she came out to retrieve it. She opened it. It said, "Thank you." That was all. No name. But the handwriting was the deliberate, careful print of someone who hadn't been schooled easily and knew it. She kept the note. She put it in the back of the book she was reading and told herself she'd throw it out when she found it again. She found it 6 times over the course of the winter. She didn't throw it out any of them. In March, when the snow was still on the ground but the light had changed, that particular shift that happens in the foothills when you suddenly believe spring might be real, Seth Briar came to the school board meeting. This was unusual. The meeting was held in the church hall and generally attended by the same 7 people who attended everything, plus whoever had a specific complaint. Seth had no children and no particular stake in the school's business, and he stood at the back with his arms crossed and his hat in his hands and didn't say anything through the first 40 minutes. The board was discussing Cora's contract. The 1-year extension had run its course again, and Leonard Vickers, who ran the general store and had opinions about budgets, was suggesting that perhaps the school could make do with a part-time arrangement, perhaps combine with the next valley over perhaps. "She's the best teacher this valley's had in 15 years, Seth said. Everyone turned. He hadn't raised his voice. He said it the way he said most things, as though he'd worked out the statement carefully before saying it, and was now simply reporting a conclusion. "I'm not on the board," he added, "so I don't get a vote. But if it matters to anyone what the town thinks, that's what this town thinks." Leonard Vickers opened his mouth. "That's what this town thinks," Seth said again quietly. The contract was renewed. 3-year term this time. Cora heard about it the next day from Hazel Muir, who had heard it from Berta Ashby, who had been sitting 2 rows from Seth at the meeting. She sat with the information for a long time before she did anything with it. What she did, eventually, was cross the lane. She knocked on the open door of the forge. Seth looked up from what he was working on. A hinge for someone's barn gate by the look of it. Petch raised his head and then put it back down. "I heard you spoke at the meeting," she said. You didn't have to do that." "No," he said. He set down his tools and turned to face her. "I didn't." She stood in the doorway with the March wind at her back and the forge heat in her face and tried to think of what she'd meant to say. It had seemed clearer on the other side of the lane. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He picked his tools back up. She left. But at the edge of his property, she stopped and turned around, and he was watching her again from the forge doorway. She could see him against the orange light, and this time he didn't look away when she caught him. Neither did she. They stood there a moment in the cold 30 feet apart, not saying anything. Then she went home. There are moments like this in every slow story, the ones where 2 people are circling something true, and both of them know it, and neither of them is quite ready. The wanting is there. The will is not quite there yet, and the distance between those 2 things can stretch out for a very long time if nobody does anything about it. Spring came grudgingly, as it does in the foothills, and then all at once, 3 weeks of mud and gray sky, and then one morning the whole valley was green. Cora's students were impossible to keep indoors. She started conducting some lessons outside, which was not strictly approved by the school board, and which she judged they'd never find out about. Having her students count the types of wildflowers they could identify and write their observations in their copybooks while sitting in the long grass at the edge of the schoolyard. Seth noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed most things she'd come to understand in that quiet way of his. Not obtrusively. Not in a way that demanded acknowledgement, but steadily, the way you'd watch weather coming in from the mountains with patient attention. In April, he fixed the schoolhouse steps. She hadn't said they needed fixing. They had needed fixing. In May, he brought Petch around on a Saturday morning and let the younger children pet him, which Petch endured with enormous dignity, and which made Cora like Seth more than was entirely comfortable. She didn't do anything about it. She had a reason. Or something she called a reason. There was a man in Lethbridge, not a current man, not anymore, but the memory of one, which sometimes amounts to the same thing in terms of how cautious it makes you. His name had been Robert, and she'd thought she'd known what he was, and she'd been wrong about that in a way that had taken her a long time to stop thinking about. She didn't tell people this. She didn't see the point of explaining why she was careful. She was just careful. But Hazel Muir had the instincts of someone who'd run a boarding house for 20 years, and one evening in May, when the 2 of them were sitting on the back step with cups of tea and the light going long and golden over the hills, Hazel said, without particular preamble, "That Seth Briar is a good man." "I know." Cora said. You know, Hazel said. A pause. Do you believe it, though? Cora looked at her. Knowing and believing, Hazel said, aren't always the same thing, especially once someone's given you reason not to believe. She didn't mention Robert. She didn't have to. Hazel Muir didn't require information. She just saw. He wouldn't give me reason, Cora said, and then stopped because she hadn't meant to say that out loud. Hazel smiled at her tea. No, she said. I don't think he would either. Summer brought the valley to life in the usual way. The pass road open, supply wagons coming through, families arriving from the east who wanted to try the ranching life and would find out the truth of it by winter. The school let out in June, and Cora spent her days differently. Gardening in Hazel's yard, helping with the books at the church, reading in the shade in the afternoons. She saw Seth most days. The forge was busy in summer. More horses, more equipment, people fixing what the winter had broken. Petch moved his sleeping spot from the forge doorway to the south side of the building where the sun hit longest. There was a community supper in July. Out at the McTavish place, long tables set up in the yard and every family in the valley contributing something. Cora brought a spice cake. Seth arrived late, directly from the forge. She could tell because he still had soot at his jaw that he'd missed in washing, and he ended up at the far end of the table, and for most of the evening they were 12 people apart. But at the end of the night, when people were helping clear the tables and the children were running in the last of the light, she found herself beside him, stacking plates. You've got. She gestured at her own jaw. He rubbed at it, missed. Other side, she said. He got it. He looked embarrassed in a way that she found, privately, devastating. Long day, he said. She picked up another stack of plates. It's a good supper every year. A pause. I saw the gardens doing well, he said. Hazel's garden, she said. You planted the back half of it. She looked at him. How do you know that? He had the grace to look caught. Hazel mentioned it, he said, which they both knew was not entirely true. She should have let it go. She almost did. Seth, she said. He looked at her. Why do you do that? Do what? Notice things, she said. Fix things, and then not say anything about it. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the supper was winding down, people calling their children in, the light going amber and long. He turned his hat in his hands, one slow turn, twice, and then he looked at her with the directness that he almost never used, and that, when he did, was rather hard to look away from. Because I didn't think it was my place to say, he said. Why not? Because I didn't know if you'd want me to. She set down the plates. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and for a moment there was nothing in the yard but the low voices of people packing up, and the sound of the creek in the distance, and the feeling of something that had been patient for a very long time, getting tired of waiting. I would want you to, she said. He held her gaze. He breathed in. He said, I've been wanting to tell you something for about a year. Then tell me. And Seth Briar, who fixed things without being asked, who spoke once and meant it, who had watched Cora Vett cross the lane in all seasons and never quite said why, he said, I think you're the best thing that ever happened to this town, and I think you know that I mean more than the town. Cora was quiet for a moment. She'd thought she'd known what it would feel like when someone said something real. She'd been bracing for it in the wrong direction. She'd been ready to feel afraid. She felt none of that. She felt only very calm and very sure and quietly grateful to Hazel Muir for a conversation on a back step in May. I know, she said. I've known for a while. A pause. So have you? About me. You just needed me to say it first. He didn't deny it. He smiled, which he didn't do often and which was therefore worth waiting for. Fair enough, he said. They walked home along the creek road in the long summer dark, not holding hands. It was too new for that, too careful, but close enough that their arms brushed, and the night was warm. And Petch had materialized from somewhere, and was trotting ahead of them as though he'd been expecting this development, and was simply pleased it had finally occurred. There are people who fall in love loudly all at once, in ways that everybody notices and talks about. Seth and Cora were not those people. What they had been built over the course of 2 winters, in small acts and watched silences and tea left on steps. in the careful tending of something that neither of them had named until they were sure of it. By autumn, they were sure. By the following spring, when the schoolhouse got its third leak and Seth fixed it, properly, this time with new boards and fresh tar, and Cora brought him tea in the forge, not because she was being careful about it, but because she wanted to. The whole valley had rearranged itself quietly around this fact, the way valleys do. And one afternoon in October, almost 2 years exactly from the Tuesday, she'd been standing on a chair with a flour sack, and he'd told her the floor was old pine. He came into the schoolhouse after the children had gone home, and he asked her to marry him, standing in the same spot he'd stood that first day, hat in both hands. Cora looked at him across the empty classroom, in the late-day light coming through the windows she'd taped against the cold. "Yes," she said, not quickly, not slowly, just certainly the way you say a thing when you've already known it for a long time and are simply glad to finally say it out loud. He crossed the room. He put his hat on the nearest desk, the hat she'd watched him turn in his hands for 2 years, and he took her face in both his careful, work-round hands, and he said very quietly, "I see you, Cora. Not I love you. Not yet. That came later on the walk home, easily. But I see you," which meant, I have been seeing you. All of it. The teaching and the tea on the step and the way you look at the mountains in the early morning when you think no one is watching. I see you, and I am not afraid of what I see, and I never was. That, if you want to know, is the whole of it. A schoolhouse with a leaking roof, a man who fixed things quietly, a woman who left tea on steps and kept notes she meant to throw out, 2 winters and 1 summer and a supper table and a walk along a creek in the dark. It doesn't sound like much when you list it, but you know, if you've ever waited for something real and then had it arrive, you know exactly how much it was.